Hi guys, lecture 2 of the module, and this is really quite an intense, I guess theoretical lecture which is going to give you, I think, some key terminology and really some key ideas which underpin a lot of the thinking that goes on around social media. And I'm going to critique some of them along the way as well. But these are really foundational parts of our thinking. And when it comes to your reflective essay on your project, more likely than not, you're going to be using some of the material from this lecture. So it's important that I address the kind of important theoretical stuff that goes on. So it's a two-parter. So I'm going to try and make it a little bit broken down. If I was doing this in one go, the video would probably stretch out to about an hour. Which is not great. I don't think, watching a video for that long, unless it's got explosions and sex scenes and what have you, it's not great. So I'm going to try and break it up for you, and I'm going to take the participatory culture part mostly in the second one, and look really at networking in the first part. So in terms of an outline of what I'm going to try and achieve in these two lectures that I'm doing for week 2, we're going to be looking at what is a network and why is that important, what is network theory and the network society and why are these critically important ideas, what is participatory culture, what is platform capitalism. Now that's a very important concept which I think people do need to reflect upon when they're looking at their own social media usage. What is the sharing economy? This foregrounds discussions of social media, and it is important we get a grip of it, albeit I don't think many projects would concern themselves with aspects of the sharing economy. But weirdly, your future employment might well have something to do with this, so this is very important. How does network theory and network analysis relate to social media? Obviously, making that link is very important. And what are the implications for network society for our understanding of social media? And that really is the critical question. What is it about this material on network society and participatory culture? What can that give us in terms of understanding social media? Because obviously the fundamental thing that I'm trying to get you to do in this module is to look at your own social media practice very, very critically. So how can we bring this stuff on board? Let's begin with a discussion of what a network is. And really a network and the idea of the network is really an absolutely critical metaphor for understanding digital culture. It's been used really since before digital culture really existed, but existed theoretically to try and understand how digital culture fits together, what is its basic overall structure, how do different parts of it link to one another. Now, it's a very obvious way to do things is to try and understand social networks through network theory. But importantly, in this module, I'm not asking you to understand social networks, I'm asking you to understand social network culture. The module title is very, very important. So in that sense, what we want to take from our understanding of networks is how does it help us understand those cultures rather than how does it explain social media as an entire thing. Because network theory actually would inform your understanding of social media at a very technical level often. And I'm really focusing on that cultural aspect in this module, and I want you to understand social media as a cultural phenomena. So network theory is going to be useful to us, but we're also going to want to challenge it, as it implies that the network is the source of power in society rather than the individuals. And really what my focus on this module is, by giving you the assignment that I have, and the kind of focus of it is to try and get you to realize that really the individual is the important unit in the social network rather than the network itself. Now, in a network theory, individuals are only individual nodes in a network, and they are ascribed power as part of a network rather than having any autonomy themselves. So it's actually quite a dehumanizing theory, network theory, in many regards. And it's another reason why I'm not that keen on it in terms of understanding the phenomena of social media, maybe the architecture of social media, but the architecture is quite divorced from the reality of how we experience social media. Key theorist in network theory is Manuel Castells. Castells introduces 4 kinds of power in the network society, which is important for us to know: networking power, network power, networked power, and network making power. Now, he's inspired by the sociologist Max Weber, who we encountered last week, and he defines power as the relational capacity that enables a social actor to influence asymmetrically the decisions of other social actors in ways that will favour the empowered actors' will, interest and values. Now, let's unpack that a little bit. What Castells is saying is that in a network, power exists in an asymmetrical way. So some actors in the network have more power than others. If it was symmetrical, we would all have the same types of power in the network. Castells rejects this. He says, but this is not the case. By leveraging the features of a network in particular ways, actually individuals can have more power and can compel people to act in particular ways. So in itself, I think that's an important idea when we're understanding social media. If we look at a network like Instagram, for example, we know for a fact that there are certain individuals who have more power than others in that network. We call them influencers very often. And the influencer uses the network, albeit this may not be a conscious thing that people do, but they utilize the features of the network to leverage certain power relationships, usually for the course of trying to get money. So I think Castells' idea is very, very important in that sense. Now, in terms of network power here, power is associated with coercion, dominance, violence or potential violence, and importantly for us, asymmetry. So Castells is really building on the work of Foucault, Weber, Habermas, and argues that he builds on Giddens' notion of a structuration theory. However, my first contention about Castells is that he doesn't actually understand Giddens at all. Now, for Giddens, power is transformative capacity, the capability to intervene in a given set of events in some way to alter them, the capability to effectively decide about course of events, even when others might contest such situations. Power is, for Giddens, a characteristic of all social relationships. It is routinely involved in the instantiation of social practices, and it operates through everyday human actions. So, for Anthony Giddens, power exists everywhere, and power relationships exist everywhere. And really, when we think about... If you think about Castells' notion of power, this becomes very, very problematic, because Castells believes, certainly that end part about routinely involved in the instantiation of all social practices, Castells is quite marked that this is a feature of the network society. So this power asymmetry and so on is an occurrence of network society. Giddens actually would disagree and say it's always been around, and I tend to agree with Anthony Giddens. So in Giddens' structuration theory, power is not necessarily coercive, violent, or asymmetrical anyway. Power can be used in a very positive fashion. You know, we can have power to create good. It's kind of a nice theory in that way. The problem with Castells' notion of power is he does see it as coercive and violent and dominative power relationships, and he sees those as foundational relations of society throughout history. And that simply probably isn't true. Giddens is onto something. There's much more nuance involved with power. We can have the power to do good. We can have the power to improve social conditions, not just worsen them, or worsen them for some in order for us to gain. So Castells is really quite negative in his perspective on power. And really, when we ask ourselves, is it likely that all of history of humankind and all social situations which we live in are always shaped by power struggles, coercion and violence? Very, very doubtful. And is that reality of our interactions through social media? Not all. I mean, some may be. You know, some interactions in social media can be quite argumentative, quite negative, you know, can be characterized by certain sets of power struggles, but that's not routine in any way, shape or form. So when we look at Castells' notion, I mean, it is important, this notion in particular of the asymmetry here is very, very important as far as I'm concerned. But Castells casts it in such a negative light, and even the asymmetry of communication through social media doesn't have to be a negative thing. So it is important to recognise that there are issues with Castells, and but the idea itself is quite important. Now, if we think back to last week's video, and you recall Marx from that, I mean, considering the social we encountered Marx and Tönnies, cooperation is critical to understanding the social, and there's not anything about cooperation in Castells. So we kind of, right at the beginning of this lecture, I'm sort of dissing this guy big time, right? And, you know, power relationship perhaps going on there. And you should be asking the question, why are you even talking about this guy? You have just slaughtered him. What is the matter with you? Well, maybe there is something we can salvage here, but it's important to note that cooperation is not part of this. And ostensibly, is not part of this kind of network theory either, the idea of cooperative action, which for Marx and Tönnies, and indeed as it emerges upwards when we think of Jörg Stimmel and people like that, cooperative action is very important in terms of what the society is. So why are networks important? Well, for Van Dijk, networks have laws, and that's why they're very important to understand. So from the adaptive structuration theory perspective, society and communications media mutually change one another. So media enables, constrains, and defines thought through history. This is, a McLuhanist idea. Merovitz I've thrown in there as well as an important contributor to that. Now, for Van Dijk, networks have become defining structural characteristic of society, and therefore they're critically important in understanding contemporary culture. The metaphor of the network has become so critical to us, and we can reflect on what I am doing right now. I'm sitting here in mid-November. It is dark outside. It's raining heavily. It's really quite a depressing evening. I've got the heating on because it's cold. I'm wearing a sort of lined hoodie because I'm really chilly at the moment. And I'm talking at the computer screen. I'm not talking to you guys. But what is happening here is that education at the moment has become a functionary of a network. During the pandemic, what we've been asked to do is become nodes in networks. We are linked together by the virtual learning environment, which you are watching this video on at this very given time. Critically in this, the university has adopted the ideas, whether it's conscious or otherwise, has adopted the ideas of the network as a way to function through the pandemic. And what we see, therefore, is me acting as a node in this network, and you guys acting as nodes in the network also. And moreover, the virtual learning environment itself is part of the network, and this video is part of that network, is an object in the network. Now, what Van Dijk is saying is that notion of the network has become critically important in structuring society itself. We use metaphors of the network to understand society in critically important ways, from transportation, where we picture places on a train line or on a bus route, and so on. Even on our Google map, we look at our car as part of an interlinking network of points in space, to education itself being rethought of in terms of networking. We even use the term, are you any good at networking? It's become a fundamental part of understanding the world itself, and so therefore it's very important, if we're talking about social media culture being the dominant culture of contemporary society, when the network is so important in understanding society today, it's important for us to understand it. Now, to go back to Castells. Castells argues that mass self-communication, i.e. social media, although he was writing that at a time when social media perhaps wasn't of the magnitude that it is today. So 2009, you can imagine Castells was writing this book in about 2007, 2008, so it's not hit huge at that point. But even in that point, when he's writing this work, it's very interesting he picks up that mass self-communication is a novel quality of communication in contemporary society. Castells argues that the contemporary internet is shaped by a conflict between the global multimedia business networks that try to commodify the internet and the creative audience that tries to establish a degree of citizen control of the internet and to assert the right to communicative freedom without corporate control. He could have been writing about Facebook. No, I'll reiterate, he wasn't, but he could well have been writing about Facebook. Castells argues that really the fundamental power relationship that we need to concern ourselves with in a social media age is the relationship between the big company, Facebook, which I also include in terms of WhatsApp and Instagram, Twitter, Google with its YouTube and so on. We are in battle with these ones who look to commodify us as an audience, and we know this is the case, and I'm going to talk more about it obviously in lecture 5, but and really get into that. And us as an audience who are trying to assert our own degree of control. And here's the power asymmetry. You have huge corporations on one side and us, the small little guy, being crushed underneath them. So that's where I think Castells' notion of networking is important for us to understand. That we are always, when we're using social media, we are locked in this asymmetrical power struggle with the corporation, which platform we are using at that time. So this tension defines some of the characteristics of social media as networks and some characteristics of our modern society in general. We're always trying to be free in our expression while expressing ourselves through corporate mass media platforms engaged in mass surveillance and data harvesting. So the power relationship between the corporate media and the creative users that Castells describes is an asymmetrical one. The privileges, the former, and by the former here I'm talking about the platform itself. Therefore, through the lens of network theory, we can understand that all Web 2.0 platforms, all social media, involve this tension. So everything that we do on social media is a reflection in some way of this tension between the power relationship that we have with the platform. And that's why Castells' network idea is very, very useful to us. Now, that's really all I want to say about network society. I'm going to move swiftly on into participatory culture here, because I think participatory culture flows from the idea of networks. If we have the idea of networks with us, then participatory culture becomes easier to understand. But the network theory aspect then, what Castells said, also works as a very kind of brutal critique of this notion of participatory culture as well. Now here's the key guy in participatory culture, Henry Jenkins. Jenkins unfortunately is kind of falling from favor these days. I say unfortunately, I don't actually mean it. He's done some very, very stupid things over the last few months with regards to the marginalization of black academics and female academics in fan studies. So it's not unfortunate at all. He needs to be called out on it, and he has extensively been called out on it online. So in terms of participatory culture, though, what can we take from Henry Jenkins' work? For Henry Jenkins, the main characteristic of social media, what he terms Web 2.0 back in the work he did in 2009, is that they are spreadable. That type of media spreads. Consumers play an active role in spreading content. Consumers in this models are grassroots advocates for materials which are personally and socially meaningful to them. It's interesting for me that he uses the word consumers here. He does picture us as media consumers still. But in terms of participatory culture, we use the media to spread content around the network. So that's when the network becomes important as well. So that notion of network still exists here. I don't think Jenkins has a very good critique of network, unfortunately. So for spreadable media based on the logic, if it doesn't spread, it's dead, and involve audiences that actively shape media flows so that culture becomes far more participatory. The meme is a classic example of what we mean by spreadable media in this case. Created by people, take advantage of particular flows of social media to be spread. And there's a feeling of participation that something from the ground up has been spread around the world if it becomes viral. So sharing, co-creation, remixing, reuse, adaptation of content on Facebook, YouTube, and other platforms are for Jenkins a manifestation of what he calls a gift economy, which is foundation on this notion of spreadable media. And for Jenkins, he sees this as being extremely positive. For him, spreadable media empower consumers and make them an integral part of the commodity's success. The longer-term benefits include the expansion of the range of potential markets for a brand and the intensification of consumer loyalty by increasing emotional attachment to the right brand or media franchise. Interestingly, Jenkins is really riffing on digital PR here, I think, and the role that audiences on social media play in PR itself. Now, this is a highly capitalistic model and accepts a number of assumptions about network users. And I'll get into that, but mostly what we think of as consumers are part of what is known as that we're actually positioned as consumers, that we're thought of only as being consumers is a big part of participatory culture, and that in itself is a real problem. Jenkins defines different kinds of media, so spreadable media versus sticky media. Spreadable media seeks to motivate and facilitate the efforts of fans and enthusiasts to spread the word, for example, whereas sticky media is all about holding attention and so on. So he uses, and it's not quite as simple to say that sticky media is traditional non-digital, non-social media, because there's some social media which would be sticky as well. But really what he's doing here is trying to argue that spreadable media itself is a better form of media and more empowering for us as media users. So in terms of what forms of spreadable media there are, spreadable media is the media that comes from the activity of consumers that shape and push that media through channels, and it could include memes, status updates, hashtags, any other social media content really. What he's talking about here in terms of spreadable media is what we create and what we recreate and what we remediate through our social media usage. You know, not just the image that we use, but perhaps the meme that we share or the video that we saw on YouTube, you know, and we share on a particular social media channel. This is all part of really spreadable media. So how does this all fit together? Well, in terms of spreadable media as a culture, last week obviously we looked at cultures. Now, the basic sociological definition of a culture states that all culture has 5 elements, according to Kat Edenberg: symbols, language, values, norms, and artifacts. If we think about memes, do memes have symbols? Are they symbolic? Yes, they are. Do they have language? Yes, they do. Do they have values? Absolutely. So there's a set of values embedded in a meme. Do they have norms for production? Yes, they do. And are they material artifacts? Yes, because they are spread around. So we might just have an example here of a spreadable culture, right? So if we think, you know, memes. Memes are spreadable media. What is a meme? It's an activity, concept, catchphrase, or piece of media that spreads, often as a mimicry or for humorous purposes, from person to person via the internet. So an internet meme usually takes the form of, and you guys know this, you know, you've got one right up in front of you, you know, the image and the text could include intentional misspellings. It almost always subverts the meaning of the photo in some way to recreate the meaning of the image itself by anchoring it in a particular way. So these small movements tend to spread from person to person via social network, blogs, direct email, news sources, and they could relate to existing internet subcultures in particular ways. But what Jenkins is saying here is that, you know, these are created, these are spread by, they're spread by people who have common interests and common sense of humor and so on and so forth. This is spreadable media. So spreadable media really then is part of communication culture in today. You know, if we look at, you know, digital media, I'm using McLuhan's notion of communication cultures here: the oral, the written, the print, and the electronic. We went through this last year, and really in today's one, if we think of the digital as a thing, you know, spreadable media is, if you adapt that McLuhanist notion of the media is the message. You know, so what is the message of this? Spreadable media, what is the message of it in McLuhan's terms? Well, you know, how does it inform our culture? It says that, you know, things can go crazy, things can spread around the world instantly. You know, being creative can get you anywhere, and you know, that creativity can blow up. And this is, you know, I'm using memes as an example here, but if you think of like famous YouTubers, you think of Insta influencers, you know, these guys work on these kind of same principle of spreadable media. You know, their content gets spread incredibly far and wide, and because of that, they're able to leverage that spreadability of their content in order to become famous, I guess, you know. So what are we supposed to take from this? Well, Jenkins argues that spreadable media empower consumers, again that word consumers, and makes them an integral part of a commodity's success. Commodity here, he's really referring, for our purposes, I think, to the platform, you know, Instagram, YouTube, etc. Longer term benefits would include the expansion of the range of markets, and I've been through this before. It's highly capitalistic and it sets a number of assumptions about network users, mostly that we're consumers. Now you can see this is a repeat slide, right? But I want to reiterate that point when I finish this video here, which I'm just about to do. I'm really going to jump off on that idea of consumers and participatory culture in video 2. And it's important because the way that we're thought of as users of social networks is really, really important in terms of a theory and how it describes social media. The participatory culture theory, which is important to us, it's something important to understand, does picture us as consumers of things. And that is a problem, my friends, but I will jump into this in video 2.